The prairie lay stretched wide and silent beneath the falling dusk, its grasses bending low beneath a tired wind. Shadows reached long across the dust, turning fence posts into crooked silhouettes against the amber sky. Somewhere in the stillness, the faint sound of movement stirred, too quiet to be hooves, too soft to be the howl of any prowling beast. It was a sound half swallowed by the wind, like the flutter of a trapped bird's wings. Then came a muffled gasp, broken, desperate, trembling against the silence. "Please, open it. I can't breathe." The voice was faint, rising from the ground itself, carried within a rough, lumpy sack lying abandoned beside the weathered post. Its coarse canvas twitched as though alive, as though the earth itself had learned to struggle for air. Dust clung to the fabric, dimming what little light still lingered, and the cords that bound it were pulled cruelly tight. Again the voice came, cracking like brittle wood, softer this time. "Please, open it. I can't breathe." Down the trail rode a man alone, reins loose in one hand, his broad shoulders slouched with the weight of long days and longer nights. His horse moved steady, as if it knew the path home better than its rider. The man's face, rough-hewn by sun and years, was half hidden beneath the brim of his hat. To those who knew of him, he was a rancher whose land stretched wide and whose barns stood proud. To those who looked closer, which was few, he was a man hollowed out by solitude, his strength a shell that covered silence. His wealth kept him above want, yet never near warmth. The sound made him draw his horse to a halt. He narrowed his eyes toward the sack, watching the faint, unnatural movement within it. His breath caught as the muffled plea reached his ears again, and he remained still, as if the prairie itself held him suspended between decision and retreat. He had lived long enough to know the cruelty men carried in their hearts, and he thought of all manner of tricks or traps. Bandits lured with voices. Desperate strangers begged only to take more than was offered. Trust was dangerous, and he had learned to guard his heart, his home, his very silence. Yet the voice was not like the harsh bark of a liar, nor the wild shout of a thief. It trembled. It begged as though hope was thin and fleeting, as though breath itself had become precious. Against his better judgment, the man swung down from his saddle, boots pressing into the soft dust. He stood before the sack, the wind tugging at his coat, the silence pressing heavy around him. For a long moment he did nothing, his calloused hands hovering at his sides. His life had been built on caution, and caution had kept him safe, but something in that trembling plea gnawed deeper than fear. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he crouched low. His fingers brushed the coarse rope, and the sack shivered beneath his touch. His jaw clenched, his chest rising and falling with the weight of hesitation. He pulled at the knot once, twice, until the cord gave way beneath his strength. The fabric loosened, collapsing in tired folds, and with it came a rush of breath from within, sharp and desperate, the sound of life fighting to remain. From the dim hollow of the sack, a young woman's face emerged. She was pale beneath the dust, strands of dark hair clinging to her damp brow. Her lips parted as she gulped the cool evening air, eyes wide and glistening, as though she had been pulled back from the edge of vanishing. She looked no older than 21, her beauty not the polished kind admired in parlors, but something raw, born of resilience and hardship. The lines of exhaustion etched her cheeks, yet in her gaze lived a light that hardship had not yet extinguished. The rancher froze. For all his strength and all his years, he felt an unfamiliar tremor stir within him, a recognition of something fragile yet unbroken. He had expected anything but this. Stolen goods, some trick of desperate men, perhaps even death itself left behind in canvas. Instead he found her, breathing raggedly, her chest rising and falling as though every breath was a victory. She whispered again, softer now, voice frayed but steadying. "Thank you." He said nothing. Words did not come easily to him, and now, with her eyes fixed on his, he found his silence heavier than ever. He could not yet ask who had bound her, nor why she had been left in the dust like forgotten grain. He could only stand there, the sack fallen away at his boots. His world shifted in a breath. The prairie seemed to lean closer, as if even the land itself waited for what would follow. The fading sun painted her face in bands of gold and shadow, and the evening wind tugged at the ragged hem of her dress. She looked so small against the endless horizon, so out of place in her suffering, yet there was a strength about her that unsettled him, a quiet defiance in the way she pulled air into her lungs and steadied herself against despair. For a long moment, neither moved. The rancher felt the weight of her presence settle upon him, stirring memories he had long buried. Times when he too had known the ache of betrayal, when trust had left scars that wealth could never soothe. He wondered who had done this to her, what cruelty had cast her into such torment. But he did not ask, not yet. Instead, he offered his hand, rough and scarred, unsure if she would take it. For a breath, she only looked at it, as though weighing whether to trust again. Then, slowly, her slender fingers reached out, trembling, and rested in his palm. The contact was slight, but it carried the weight of choice. Hers to trust, his to protect, both fragile as glass. He helped her to her feet, the sack crumpled and forgotten between them. She swayed, weak from her ordeal, but stood with quiet dignity. He studied her, seeing not just her exhaustion, but the courage that lived beneath it. And in that instant, something shifted within him, something he had not allowed himself to feel for many years. The silence between them thickened, no longer empty, but filled with an unspoken question neither dared to voice. The prairie wind howled through the grass, carrying away the dust, carrying away the daylight. And as the last rays of sun slipped behind the horizon, he realized with a chill that the sack at his feet was not just a prison she had escaped. It was a reminder, a cruel symbol, of how the world had chosen to discard her. The sight of it made his chest tighten, his breath hitch, as though he too had been bound within it all these years without knowing. He looked back at her, and in her weary eyes he saw not only survival, but a story yet untold, a story that would change his life in ways he could not yet fathom. And though the night crept in around them, the true weight of the moment only began to dawn. The night settled slow upon the land, cloaking the wide plains in shadows that softened every sharp line. Within the ranch house, lamplight glowed faintly against the wooden walls, its flame wavering with each restless breath of wind. The young woman sat near the hearth, her hands clasped in her lap, as though still bound by the ropes that had held her hours before. She stared at the fire with a quiet intensity, her profile drawn sharp against the glow, her shoulders slumped yet unwilling to fold entirely. The rancher moved about the room with heavy steps, his silence as steady as the creak of the floorboards beneath him. He had given her a blanket and food without question, yet no words passed his lips. He had lived too long with silence to know how to break it now. Still, he felt her presence ripple through the house like wind through grass, filling spaces once dulled by solitude. He studied her without seeming to, catching the fragile strength in the way she lifted the spoon, the way she forced each swallow past a throat still raw from suffocation. He could not ask, not yet, what cruelty had cast her into a sack and left her for dead. But the questions burned within him as steadily as the firelight at his feet. At last she spoke. Her voice was soft, stripped of all ornament, yet it carried the weight of truth. She told him she had once belonged to a man who claimed love but held only pride. That man had spoken sweetly until hardship came, until hunger gnawed at their bones, and the future seemed a thing of ash. Then he cast her aside like worn boots, too proud to bear the burden of poverty, too shallow to see her worth. With nowhere to turn, she wandered town to town, seeking work, a corner to sleep in, a scrap of kindness. Yet doors shut, whispers rose, and hands that might have lifted her chose, instead, to push her farther down. She paused then, the flicker of fire painting her face in shifting light, as though her sorrow was being etched upon the air itself. She did not weep, though her voice trembled like a taut wire. She spoke of nights spent beneath bridges, mornings with no bread, and the cruelty of strangers who saw only shame where there should have been compassion. Her tale did not beg for pity. It revealed endurance, the kind forged in shadows when the world turns its back. The rancher listened, the muscles in his jaw tight, his gaze fixed on the flames rather than her eyes. Something in her story mirrored the old wounds he carried. Once he too had loved. Once, he too had believed a promise that dissolved in the face of betrayal. His wealth had come later, earned by grit and stubbornness, but no amount of land or cattle had softened the hollow carved into him. He had wrapped his silence around that wound like barbed wire, letting no one near enough to reopen it. Yet here she was, a stranger whose pain echoed his own, sitting in his home as if fate had guided her steps directly to the place where his loneliness lived. She looked toward him then, her gaze searching, as though she feared her confession might drive him to send her away. He offered no words, but something in his stillness shifted, less like stone, more like soil that might one day yield. She seemed to sense it, for her shoulders relaxed, and a small breath escaped her lips, neither relief nor despair, but something in between. The following days unfurled with a quiet rhythm. She rose early, her figure moving through the dawn mist with a grace untrained but earnest. She swept the floor, fetched water, mended what she could, though her hands bore no practice in such tasks. He watched from the distance of his chores, never instructing, never correcting, simply allowing her presence to thread itself into the life he had thought unchangeable. At the table, they shared meals in silence that no longer felt oppressive but tentative, as though words might one day find their way between them if given patience. Side voices entered their world like ripples disturbing still water. An old ranch hand, leathery and wise, eyed the woman with guarded suspicion. A widow from the nearest homestead offered kindness laced with warnings, her voice low, urging the rancher to be cautious, to remember how easily trust can wound. A child who wandered often near the fence lines looked upon the young woman with innocent wonder, asking questions without malice, seeing her not as burden but as story. These voices wove a chorus of doubt and hope around them, reflecting what the world so often was, half cruel, half gentle, rarely simple. Each night, when the prairie winds howled against the walls, she sat by the fire and stared into its depths. He would find his eyes drawn to her, not out of desire but curiosity, a pull toward the resilience that kept her upright even when the world had tried to bury her. He saw in her the same stubbornness that had kept him alive when betrayal had hollowed him, and though he did not yet admit it, he felt less alone in her company. But shadows lingered. In town, whispers began to stir, the kind that twist truth into shame. Some recalled her face from the days she begged for work, others invented crueler tales, and soon her presence at the rancher's home became a story told in saloons and shops. He heard the echoes when he rode through town, saw the narrowed eyes, the lifted brows. She heard them too, though no one dared speak them to her face. At night, when she thought herself unseen, he caught the flicker of fear in her eyes, the way her hand brushed the scar a rope had left upon her wrist, as if she wondered how long safety could last before the world cast her out again. One evening, she thanked him softly, her voice carrying across the quiet table, not for the food or the roof, but for the simple fact that he had not turned her away. He met her gaze for the first time then, holding it longer than he had intended, and in that silent exchange something passed between them, unspoken but undeniable. It was not yet love, not yet even trust, but the faint recognition of two souls long bruised who had found, if only for a moment, the courage to sit in the same light. Yet, as the fire burned low and the night drew close, the rancher could not ignore the tightening in his chest. He knew shadows did not vanish simply because one wished them to. They lingered, waiting, and he feared the day hers would rise to break whatever fragile peace had begun to form. Outside, the wind carried voices from the distance, harsh, mocking, the kind that thrive on cruelty. Among them was one that made her body stiffen, her spoon pausing in midair. A voice from her past, sharp as glass, drifting across the night as though the prairie itself conspired to remind her that she could never fully escape. She set the spoon down, her fingers trembling, and the fire threw her shadow tall upon the wall, a figure both fragile and defiant. The rancher looked at her, saw the fear she tried to bury, and in that moment he understood. The past had found its way to his door, and the silence between them would no longer be enough to keep it out. The morning broke cold and pale, a thin frost glazing the ground as though the night had whispered warnings into the earth itself. The ranch lay hushed, its barns looming like sentinels, its corrals empty of motion. Inside the house, the woman stood by the window, her hands pressed lightly to the sill, her gaze fixed upon the horizon where the prairie rolled outward without end. Her eyes were ringed with sleepless shadows, her breath slow and heavy, for she had heard what he had not, the voice from her past, carried by the wind, calling her back to the cruelty she had fled. The rancher stirred in the other room, boots heavy upon the boards, shoulders still aching from yesterday's labor. He had sensed her restlessness, but had not pressed her for words. He lived in silence, so long that he mistook it for safety. Yet that silence had begun to splinter ever since she entered his life. Now, as he caught the distant tremor in her posture, he knew the storm she carried within was breaking, and that his silence might no longer protect either of them. At midday, he rode into town for supplies, the weight of stairs pressing on him with every turn of his horse's hooves. Men leaned against posts, their talk quieting when he passed. Women gathered their children close, glancing at him with disapproval, thinly veiled as pity. Whispers curled in the air like smoke, words sharp as barbs. Her name twisted, her past turned into stories that dripped with contempt. Among them, one voice rose clearer than the rest, a man with eyes too proud, a smirk that spoke of ownership long discarded. It was him, the one who had abandoned her when hunger pressed too close. He laughed as he spoke of the rancher's charity, his tone laced with venom. The rancher kept his face unreadable, his hands steady upon the reins, but inside something fierce stirred, a fire he had long buried beneath years of restraint. He said nothing, not yet. He rode home through the lengthening light, his jaw set, his silence heavy not with indifference, but with choice. That evening, he found the woman packing what little she owned, threadbare clothes, a small comb, a strip of ribbon. Her movements were deliberate, her face composed though her hands shook. She told him softly she could not bring more shame upon his name, could not see him burdened by whispers that belonged to her past. Her voice was calm, but her eyes betrayed the raw wound of rejection she feared would soon come, as it always had. He stood still, leaning against the frame of the door, his hat in his hands. Words rose to his lips, yet his silence clung stubborn, the habit of a lifetime. She mistook it for consent, for agreement, and the flicker of pain that crossed her face then struck him deeper than any wound. She whispered her thanks, gratitude laced with finality, and moved toward the door. Outside, the prairie stretched vast beneath a sky streaked with the last light of dusk. She walked quickly, her small bundle clutched to her chest, her figure outlined in fading gold. The rancher followed, his boots dragging at first, then quickening as he realized she was leaving not merely his house, but the fragile thread of connection that had begun to bind their lives together. He found her standing at the edge of the open land, the sack that once imprisoned her caught against a fence post by the wind, its fabric flapping like a cruel flag of memory. She stared at it, her shoulders trembling, her breath shallow. To her it was not mere cloth, but a symbol of every rejection, every cruel hand that had bound and discarded her. She reached for it, then withdrew, as though touching it would shatter what little strength she carried. The rancher stepped closer, his breath visible in the cooling air. For the first time in years, words broke from him, rough and unsteady. He told her she was not a burden, not a weight to bear, but the very proof that his silence had been emptiness all along. He confessed that his house had been filled with walls but never warmth, that his land stretched wide but had never felt like home. His voice cracked as he admitted he had feared to speak, feared to trust, but that watching her walk away was a wound he could not endure. She turned, her eyes wide, glistening with disbelief. She had heard promises before, had been lifted only to be thrown down again, yet there was something in his voice that carried no polish, no pride, only truth spoken as raw as open earth. She whispered that he would regret her, that one day he would see only her scars. He shook his head, stepping closer, telling her scars were proof of survival, not shame. Her tears spilled then, not of despair, but of release, as though years of silence had finally cracked open within her. She dropped the bundle she carried, the ribbon slipping free into the dust, And in that simple surrender he saw her choosing to believe, if only for this moment, that she was worthy of staying. The prairie wind rose, tossing the empty sack high into the air before dropping it lifeless into the grass. The sound of its fall echoed between them, a reminder of what she had been forced to endure, and what she might yet overcome. He reached out, his hand rough but steady, and she placed her trembling fingers within it, not with certainty, but with courage. They walked back slowly, neither speaking, the silence no longer heavy but tender, filled with the unspoken promise that words had finally begun to bridge. The ranch house loomed against the night, its windows glowing with lamplight, not a fortress, but a beacon. Inside, the fire crackled, warm and steady. They sat side by side, their shadows touching upon the wall, their hearts still raw, yet no longer closed. Outside, the world would whisper, the past would linger, but within those walls a new truth had begun to take shape. As the night deepened, the rancher looked toward her, his voice low, almost a whisper. He told her she was not the sack the world had left to suffocate. She was the breath that had broken free, the proof that even silence could learn to speak again. She turned toward him, her lips parted, her eyes wide, as though she had never heard words meant for her and her alone. And in that fragile, trembling moment, with the prairie winds pressing against the windows and the fire casting their shadows long, both of them understood that the silence, which had once imprisoned them, had at last been broken. Yet beyond the fragile glow of the lamp, the horizon stretched dark and endless, holding secrets still to come, reminding them that though they had chosen one another tonight, the world outside would not rest quietly.